Hey there, I'm Melanie.
Hi everyone, I'm Abby, and we're both excited to bring you this podcast just in time for May.
So May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and Abby's one of my good friends, and we both live with mental
discrepancies,
which is, we'll be talking a little bit about vocabulary in today's episode, which is kind of a good start. So I've lived with anxiety most of my life, and so we thought we'd take this space to kind of be open and vulnerable, and we'll be doing a series of podcasts and hope that you'll join us as we struggle to find words
and relay the information to you as two anxiety-ridden individuals.
Yes. Even though there's nobody else here.
Yeah, and we'll be covering a variety of topics from mental health, terminology, as Melanie said, the science behind the experience of mental illness, cultural stigma, self-care strategies, things like that. And so we're hoping that by sharing our understanding of our own experience and, a generalized experience of what it is to live with mental illness and to take care of one's health, we can be one step closer to normalizing mental health discourse and learning how to take care of not only ourselves, but each other.
Yeah. So,
we hope you stick around.
Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to talk about is this power of the diagnosis and the sort of language behind it and how we can kind of use it to our advantage. And we'll be talking a little bit about some of the dangers of the language as well.
Mm-hmm.
How there's this kind of fine line between when we're using certain words.
Yeah, when we're not quite, things that become so commonplace, that what is, socially acceptable, what is, acceptable for some communities versus others.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to break down, how do you work with the term neurodivergence, where it came from, how do you address it in terms of things like anxiety and depression when they're not quite like neurodevelopmental disorders. How do we navigate that? But I think, Melanie, you can start with the power of the diagnosis. So, what does it mean to have one? What is the language behind it? What does that do for someone? Maybe what are perhaps some of the risks of it?
Mm-hmm. So speaking more on a personal level, which I think we'll be kind of focusing our dialogue more around. We're not going to sit here and claim to be...
We're not medical professionals.
Right? Mental
Disclaimer,
health experts.
Asterisk. We're not.
In the fine print, that we're here primarily as people who live within that world, I guess, for lack of a better word, and how it feels for us and our own experiences. So just kind of throwing that out there. So in terms of the power of the diagnosis for me, and I guess what we mean by this is like not the diagnosis as in going to, let's say, a health professional necessarily, a psychiatrist, and telling me you have depression. For me, it was seeing a therapist, and she didn't necessarily say, yeah, you have anxiety.
This.
Right.
We can write it down and send it off to the files.
Right. And it wasn't like an automatic, okay, like this is the medication we're going to give you. So it differs for everybody. But for me, it was less of a formal kind of thing, but having the language and recognizing, okay, so these are the symptoms I have, and this is how often it happens. I think I live with anxiety. I'm having a panic attack when I'm experiencing these things. And having that language really helped me to kind of hone in on like
your own body, your mind. It empowers you that you have more control than you think you do when you know what's happening. That instead of freaking out like my body's panicking, you know that this is a panic attack, these are symptoms. Doesn't magically make it disappear.
Right.
But it helps to know that this is something that I know I can work with it. I can speak with others about it. And it's not something that no one knows about.
Right. And then when you have the language for it, you can kind of figure out what solutions there are. Because to me, when I was mid-panic attacks in middle to high school and not having that language, it literally felt like the world was caving in on me. The world's crashing down. I can't breathe. My chest would get tight. And I'd have no idea what to do but ride it out. And so that was kind of my own experience and how that power of the diagnosis and understanding what it was that was ailing me kind of helped me to confront it.
Yeah, and like we don't want to, discount the power of the diagnosis in terms of a formal one, that there is a pro to it, that, it helped for me to have an official diagnosis with, my psychologist, of that you have a social anxiety disorder, that you have, perhaps, acute depression or something like that, that having something official, that it, unfortunately, that sometimes you need those things to access certain resources.
Right.
But that, sometimes it helps to have that, to be able to, put it on the table and be like, here, like, this is what I have. Like, this isn't something I'm just making up. And it's unfortunate that you have to verify in the first place, but it does help to, know that there's something here, like there's a DSM-5. We can look at this and see. So whether you have the official diagnosis or if you don't, that there is something out there and criteria that can help you make that informed decision, but then also have someone else help you inform the decision that, we have to acknowledge that not everyone can access mental health professionals, that you can't always get a diagnosis, or that sometimes you aren't believed. And, we'll go into that in later episodes of, what is it like to try and seek out help for mental illness, that, I'm sure we have our own experiences of, being a woman and then being a woman of color. What is it like trying to get people to believe that you're experiencing something and it's not
you're not just crazy.
Yeah, you're just oversensitive, or that you're overreacting and that's all in your head. And ironically, you're like, yes, it is in the head. Thank you for pointing it out. So we'll go into that later, but, something to acknowledge when we're talking about, diagnoses and, gatekeeping and making sure we're not keeping people out of communities or, out of support that they may need.
Right. And one of the kind of key terms we wanted to talk about was neurodivergence, which I think Abby is a little more familiar with in terms of definition. I don't know. Do you want to hop into that?
Yeah, so I don't want to, I was hoping we would jump to you because I don't want to take too much space.
That's okay, it's okay.
So neurodivergence, based on my, research on it, is that it was first coined by Judy Singer, who was, I should have checked if she was alive or not. But they were on the spectrum with autism, and they were sociologists from Australia, and they first coined the term neurodivergence. And so this was often used for people with neurodevelopmental disorders, so things like anything on the autism spectrum, anything that affects someone's development, their ability to, for cognition or learning, things like that. So something where there's, people would often consider a disability in the U.S., something like that, that can be verified, that there's a certain medical way of breaking it down. And so that we wanted to address that and, acknowledge that, we're not saying that depression and anxiety are on the same scale as someone who's who has a neurodevelopmental disorder. That's not what we're trying to equate. And so we don't want to take space away from those who say they're neurodivergent, in that sense. But that can be helpful to, have some type of tangential, maybe umbrella category, that people who struggle with mental illness are perhaps neurodivergent, that the way I navigate the world, I'm sure Melanie navigates the world, is a little bit different, that when we have to consider things, that anxiety, it doesn't just go away, it doesn't magically go away, but then also not quite saying, you're diseased, that you're sick, you're broken. We don't want to rely on that terminology, as it's been historically used to demean and undermine and say that there's something wrong with you, versus, how can we help you, navigate this, like a, was it normal? Atypical, like a neurotypical.
Neurotypical,
right? Neurotypical world, one that doesn't consider people who have panic attacks, or people who have days where they, like episodes where they just can't do things. They're just feeling down in the dumps, chronically. Like, how do you account for that? That they need to be able to access this world the same way someone on the spectrum needs to be able to access the world in an equitable way. So, not labeling people, as wrong or incorrect, but rather it's just another way of functioning, that we can help alleviate symptoms, but still accept that, it's part of who we are. That's not amazing to be like, yeah, we suffer from anxiety, but it's that, we have it, but we function and we live alongside of it.
And I think a huge part of that and the mental stigma is the language, right? I've met a lot of people who are like, it's all just semantics, like, saying committed suicide versus died by suicide. I read an article recently about why we should try to shift our language to died by suicide, because committed has certain connotations that are not always taken, we associate it with committing a crime, committing a felony, things that kind of
are wrong, that there's something morally wrong with having a mental illness.
Right. But I think kind of paying attention to that language is important, especially when it comes to giving space to people who live with these, again, struggling to figure out if I want to say disorder or illness, or we need to come up with our own word. But
yeah. I mean, but we can rely that we're not just saying disorder, that in the DSM-5, the diagnoses for things like major depressive, it's called major depressive disorder. Generalized anxiety is generalized anxiety disorder. Social anxiety is social anxiety disorder. So in the medical terminology, you know, in that official book, that it is labeled as a disorder. But then also knowing that, you know, we see these things like autism spectrum disorder, that these things, that language of a disorder means there's something out of order, there's something wrong here. You know, it's not just, you know, something's different. It is that we have socially ascribed a meaning. There's a connotation to it. It's not just disorder means something needs to be cured or fixed and erased. And, you know, often people in the autism community will often address that. And I think it's something important to address across the entire mental health community, or any type of thing like that, of saying that it's not something that can always be fixed, and thus, you know, it doesn't help to have that rhetoric in the world.
Right. I think that's why the language is so important, right? I know that we're both writers, so language is very important to us.
We hope.
In general, we're writers.
Maybe.
Also works in progress, clearly. But I think, what was I going to say? Another thing that kind of I've been sort of trying to make peace with is this idea between the depression and depressive bouts. And in terms of language, like, everybody has their ups and downs, crests and troughs of life. We experience grief when we lose people, when we lose our jobs, when we lose relationships. And I think recognizing that there's agency in some cases, but other cases are a little more complicated, and where if it's, I think the definition for like depression is like 2 weeks or longer, right?
Some of them will say, I'm not sure, the DSM-5 will be like at least a month, or if it's, even if it's short, if it's debilitating, that it can count, that kind of stuff. You know, same thing with anxiety, of like, you know, you have to, is one single panic attack enough to say it? Do you even need to have panic attacks, or can it be a sustained note of tension, that kind of stuff? So how do you address that, you know, and consider that, you know, we don't want to just say, like, look up on Google, you see WebMD, it's like, you have this, this, and this, but, you know, being able to break it down so you know what feels like it applies and what feels like it doesn't, having that agency to know, you know, what fits and what doesn't. And even if you don't fit everything, that maybe you don't even need the label, that you can still address that I'm experiencing things, that symptoms of anxiety, of depression, even if I don't have it.
And I think that gives us more of a sense of control in terms of kind of navigating what it is we might be experiencing. So I think we wanted to talk a little bit about vulnerability as well.
Being able to open up. So how, you know, we're talking about diagnoses and be able to, you know, inform yourself, but how do you actually start talking about it? That's often the most difficult step, that you can do all the research and then you're like, oh, what? Who do I talk to? How do I talk to people? How do others respond to me? How can we learn to respond to people who reach out and speak up?
Right. And I mean, like, Abby and I being here now, whether it's apparent or not, and I can speak for myself, being vulnerable, I am very anxious right now, and I'm like, I wish I had a beer. But,
sure, not a cider.
Or a cider. And when I get anxious, for example, my mind kind of will go 100 million miles per hour, but at the same time, I have a hard time forming my words. So I'll kind of stumble, I'll kind of stutter.
We do lots of hand motions in this
podcast.
podcast.
I'm like, do you get it?
Take it. Help me.
Right? And that's when I'll look at Abby, I'm like, Abby, because I feel like Abby, she has a better grip of expressing
She's so
herself.
kind, because I don't.
Even though... I'm like, save me.
But then, you know, same thing of that, you know, I have trouble looking, even though I know there's no one here, that it feels better to look at Melanie, because I feel very comfortable with you, versus looking into a camera. Like, it's difficult for me to look into the lens. I'm freaking out. I'm like, I'm not looking enough. And people are like, Abby's not looking at the camera enough. You know why. It's because that's something how it manifests for me, of, you know, being able to look at, you know, make myself the center of attention. Things like that, based on, you know, me experiencing social anxiety symptoms. That I don't want people to notice me, which is kind of a catch-22, because I'm here on a podcast where we're both talking and there's only two of us.
Right. But I think having these sort of conversations in any space requires that level of vulnerability. So here we are. And I wanted to kind of start with a quote. I stole this from my therapist, who stole this from Brene Brown, who took this from Theodore Roosevelt. And I'm just going to quickly read the quote. It reads, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly." So in other words, if this podcast fails, at least it fails while we were daring greatly.
Keep telling ourselves that. That way we can finish out the rest of this.
Do you feel like you're daring greatly?
I'm daring. We'll see greatly later.
So, I mean, like, this quote I give to my students, whether they're my rhetoric students or creative writing students, all the time, because I think in any level of sharing, whether it's writing or speaking about our feelings, requires that vulnerability. And something that was interesting to me is I kind of like to open up my classes with this activity where we have like a Google Jamboard. If you're not familiar with that, you would kind of put up a word. And in this case, it was vulnerability. And then I would have all my students put up a sticky note and pick one word that they associated with vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing was that we were getting words like weakness, courage, openness, love, and we would think that innately these things kind of sit at opposite ends of the spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing about vulnerability, is that not only do we have different concepts, but it requires that balance of being open, but also feeling like maybe we're in a weaker position, but
Mm-hmm.
also having the courage to do so and express ourselves despite that.
Yeah, that, there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that as a reality, that opening yourself up in such a raw way does open you up, that there is perhaps a weakness in the sense of that there is a soft spot that's being exposed, and that, it's helpful for us to know that, and for, all of you to be informed about, so that, even if you're not the one opening up, that you're knowing that when someone opens up, either to you or in general, that you witness it happening, that you can take the steps to, engage in a way that is sensitive to that, knowing that this person is putting it all on the line here potentially for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that even if I don't understand the stakes personally, that I can empathize with, if I opened up something that was important and sensitive and secretive to me, I would want people to handle that with care. That
Right.
It's something that is fragile, especially, some cases are, more sensitive than others. That, when I first opened up about, having depression or having social anxiety, of like, this is freaking me out, that I needed to be able to trust at least my therapist, that they would, look at me and not say, that's not real, or like, that's
Right.
just, everyone goes through that. That I think that's a very common statement of, you're not the only one. And, solidarity can be approached differently with vulnerability. It's not saying, everyone goes through it versus, what you're going through is valid and, is very specific to you, but, I want you to know you're not alone. That's a very different way of saying it. And I think that's important for, understanding vulnerability, not just for yourself, but like for others as well, when you want to support them.
Right. And what this activity, that reminds me, kind of, what I was hoping would kind of like bring to light, is this idea of vulnerability as a choice, as something that we can choose to partake in, something that we can choose to do. Because I think a lot of the times we think of vulnerability as like the predator and the prey, when the prey is being chased by the predator and it's surrounded, it's cornered, and it doesn't have the might to fight back. It's vulnerable. It lacks the agency, the control to kind of get out of that situation. And I think that's how we tend to think of vulnerability. But I like the idea of shifting that a little bit and thinking about vulnerability as a choice, something that we deliberately choose to be open and share something more intimate about ourselves, in hopes that maybe we find someone who's like, I get you. And there's that solidarity and there's that connection. And I mean, I can go on, but I'd just be summarizing Brene Brown's book. I feel like I'm selling her book right now, The Gifts of Imperfection.
We're not sponsored. We're not sponsored. We don't even know her personally.
Nope.
But Melanie would like to.
I
know.
Brene Brown, I'm a huge fan if you see this. She goes into much more detail about the benefits of being vulnerable and how in that space she gives the example of we might tell somebody that we love them and we might not get the reaction we want, but inherent in that experience, we were being brave and we were taking a chance, and there's this...
Someone's rejection of that vulnerability should not invalidate it.
Right.
It's easy to say that here. Of course, when it happens, you're like, oh, I don't ever want to do that again. But, knowing that's why it takes both ends. You have to meet halfway. That someone can't just be vulnerable, because if you don't meet them halfway, it's going to turn into I have to defend my own vulnerability.
And there's the possibility that it could go the other way, and you end up creating more meaningful connections or establishing something or learning something that you didn't think was possible. And so I think that's what she does a much better job of explaining that. But
for the janky Spark Notes, like the bootleg Spark Notes, where you go to when you can't access the Spark Notes,
really? Just read the book. Abby and I would like to thank you all for joining us for our very first episode of our series. We thought it appropriate to end with this graphic by Liz Foslian, and we encourage you all to take a moment to acknowledge one of your accomplishments, whether big or small, and we hope that you'll join us again next time. Bye!